The night was thick with mist, the scent of salt and fish heavy in the air. The quiet fishing village rested under a blanket of darkness, the only sounds coming from the gentle waves lapping against the wooden pier. A lone fisherman stepped off his small boat, his movements calm, deliberate. Gabriel Costa had spent years perfecting the art of silence. He moved toward the dock, adjusting the weight of his catch over his shoulder. The night was supposed to be like any other, just another trip to the sea, another quiet return home. But tonight, something was different. He could feel the eyes on him. A group of men emerged from the shadows, their presence thick with unspoken threats. Their leader, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a scar running across his cheek, stepped forward. "You're late, fisherman," the man sneered, arms crossed. "Everyone here knows the rules. You pay for protection, or bad things happen." Gabriel's expression remained unreadable. The other fishermen in the village had surrendered to this reality long ago, their silence purchased through fear. But Gabriel wasn't just a fisherman. He was something else entirely. Once he had been a leader of men, trained for war, honed for battle. A mistake had cost him everything, pushing him into exile. Now all he wanted was peace. But peace, it seemed, was no longer an option. The men were waiting for a response, expecting fear, submission. Gabriel simply sighed, placing his catch down on the dock. His slow movements weren't those of a man giving in, they were those of a man deciding. And Gabriel Costa was not someone to underestimate. The jungle was alive with the sound of gunfire. Gabriel Costa moved swiftly, his body low to the ground, his rifle steady. The mission had been planned to perfection. Months of intelligence, reconnaissance, and strategic positioning had led them here, deep in enemy territory. His team had been confident. Gabriel had been confident. And then everything went wrong. A single miscalculation, a flaw in their intel. The compound they had infiltrated was not just a rebel stronghold. It was a trap. Hidden snipers, explosive charges rigged in the trees, and an ambush waiting for them just beyond the clearing. He remembered the chaos, the way his men had called out for cover, how the radio had been filled with static and screams. He remembered the blood staining the earth, the weight of his fallen comrades pressing down on him like ghosts. And he remembered the moment he had realized they would not all make it out alive. "Fall back," he had shouted, his voice barely cutting through the gunfire. "Regroup at the secondary point." Some had obeyed. Others hadn't had the chance. The choice he had made that day, who he had left behind, who he had saved, was a wound that had never healed. Gabriel awoke with a start, the scent of damp wood and salt replacing the smoke and blood from his dreams. His breathing was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he ran them over his face. The nightmares never truly left him. He sat up, his small cabin illuminated by the dim light of dawn filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. Outside, the waves murmured against the shore, a reminder of the life he had chosen after the army. A quiet life, a simple life, a life he didn't deserve. Gabriel swung his legs over the side of the bed, rubbing his temples. He had made peace with his past, or so he told himself. The village had given him solitude, a way to forget. Here he was just another fisherman, another man trying to make ends meet. But last night had changed everything. He still felt the weight of the encounter at the docks, the way the so-called enforcers had tried to assert their dominance over the village. He had seen men like them before, bullies feeding on the fear of the weak, and Gabriel had once been the one sent to hunt down men like them. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. He stood, instinctively cautious as he approached. When he opened it, he found Julio, the older fisherman from the night before. His lip was swollen from the beating, his eyes wary. "They're coming back," Julio said simply. Gabriel studied the man's face. There was no plea for help, no expectation. Just a simple fact, spoken by someone who had seen enough of the world to understand how these things worked. "How long?" Gabriel asked. "Tonight," Julio replied, "and they won't come to talk this time." Gabriel exhaled slowly, glancing out toward the docks. The village was just beginning to stir. Fishermen preparing for the day, children running along the shoreline. People who had no idea that the place they called home was about to become a battlefield. He should walk away. This wasn't his fight. He had done his part, served his time. He had earned his peace. But he already knew the truth. Some men were not made for peace. He turned back to Julio, his decision made. "Tell the others to stay inside tonight," Gabriel said. "Whatever happens, they don't get involved." Julio nodded, his gaze heavy with understanding. He didn't ask questions. As the older man left, Gabriel closed the door behind him, his thoughts already turning toward what was to come. He had spent years learning the art of war, perfecting the strategies that had once made him a ghost on the battlefield. Now, he would use that knowledge again. Because if they were coming for him, then they had already lost. The sun had long since disappeared, leaving only the silver glow of the moon to illuminate the quiet village. The scent of salt hung thick in the humid air, mixing with the distant crackling of bonfires lit by fishermen who had no idea of the storm about to descend upon them. Gabriel Costa stood outside his cabin, arms crossed, waiting. He had spent the day preparing, not for war, not yet, but for a message. He knew how men like these operated. Their power was built on fear, on the illusion that they were untouchable. But illusions could be shattered. The first sign of their arrival was the crunch of boots against the dirt road leading from the docks. 5 men this time. Not the 3 from before. They moved with the forced arrogance of men who had never truly been tested. At their center was a familiar figure, scarred jaw, cold eyes, the one who had led the confrontation the night before. Gabriel didn't move as they approached. "Well, Fisherman," the leader said, smirking, "you should have learned your lesson last night. But I guess some people need a second warning." Gabriel met his gaze with quiet indifference. "You talk too much." The smirk faltered, just for a second. Then, with a flick of his wrist, the leader signaled to one of his men. A thug stepped forward, rolling his shoulders, eager to prove himself. Gabriel sighed. The man threw the first punch. Gabriel moved. His body reacted on instinct, honed by years of training, by the muscle memory of war. He sidestepped, catching the attacker's wrist mid-swing, twisting it sharply. A grunt of pain followed as Gabriel swept the man's legs, sending him crashing to the ground. The others hesitated. A second mistake. Gabriel turned his gaze back to the leader. "This is your second warning." The leader's face darkened. "You think you're tough, old man?" He pulled a knife from his belt, the blade gleaming under the moonlight. Gabriel didn't blink. The second thug lunged, swinging wildly. Predictable. Gabriel ducked, his movements precise, controlled. He caught the man's arm mid-strike, twisting it just enough to force him to drop the knife. Then, with a single calculated strike to the throat, he sent the man stumbling back, gasping for breath. The remaining 3 hesitated again. Good. They were starting to realize. Gabriel took a slow step forward. "This village is not yours," he said, his voice calm, measured. "And I am not the man you want to test." The leader clenched his jaw, fury and frustration warring in his eyes. For a moment, Gabriel thought he might be reckless enough to attack himself. But then, slowly, the man lowered his knife. "This isn't over," he spat. Gabriel tilted his head. "It is if you're smart." The leader glared at him, then at his men, 2 of whom were still groaning on the ground. He exhaled sharply before turning away. "Let's go." They retreated, but not before the leader shot Gabriel one last look, one filled with something darker than anger, something closer to calculation. Gabriel watched them disappear into the night before turning toward the docks. Julio stood a few meters away, eyes wide. "That was—" Julio hesitated, searching for words. "Fast." Gabriel shook his head. "That was a mistake." Julio frowned. "What do you mean?" Gabriel exhaled. He had seen men like their leader before, men who did not take humiliation lightly. This wasn't over. If anything, it had only begun. "They'll be back," Gabriel said simply. Julio swallowed. "Then what do we do?" Gabriel turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the dark waves met the sky. "We prepare." The village was quieter than usual. Fear had settled over the people like a thick fog, an unspoken understanding that something was coming. Gabriel could feel it too. He had spent the morning repairing his fishing nets, pretending, for the sake of the others, that everything was normal. But inside, his instincts were sharp, alert. Last night had not been the end. It had only been the beginning. By midday, the warning came. A scream echoed from the market square. Gabriel's head snapped up. He was already moving before his mind fully registered the sound. He reached the center of the village in time to see the aftermath. A fruit stand had been overturned, crates smashed, produce scattered across the dirt. A woman knelt beside a man on the ground, her husband, Gabriel realized, clutching his arm. Blood dripped between her fingers, and standing over them was him, Ricardo Tubarão. Gabriel recognized the man instantly. He didn't need an introduction. The way he carried himself, the quiet menace in his expression, This was someone who didn't need to shout to be feared. A man who had built his power through action, not just words. The other criminals from the dock stood behind him, including the leader from last night. But now he wasn't in charge. Ricardo crouched beside the injured man, looking down at him as if he were a mere inconvenience. Then he turned his head slightly, his cold, dark eyes settling on Gabriel. "So you're the one causing me trouble." Gabriel held his ground, his expression unreadable. "I'm just a fisherman." Ricardo's lips curled into something that almost resembled a smile. "No, you're something else." He stood, brushing imaginary dust from his shirt. "Do you know why this village has never had problems before?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. "Because people here understand how things work. They pay, they stay in line, and in return, they stay safe." Gabriel said nothing. Ricardo tilted his head. "And then you show up, and suddenly my men come back bruised. Suddenly people start whispering. That's not good for business." Gabriel's jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of the villagers on him, watching, waiting. "So," Ricardo continued, glancing around, "I decided to send a message." He nodded toward the injured man on the ground. "To remind them what happens when people start thinking they don't need protection." Gabriel's fingers twitched at his sides. His body screamed for action, but he forced himself to remain still. There were too many of them, too many innocent people nearby. Ricardo stepped closer. "You're going to leave," he said, his voice quiet, almost friendly. "Disappear. Take your little hero act somewhere else." "And if I don't?" Gabriel asked. Ricardo's expression didn't change, but the air between them grew colder. He turned to one of his men and jerked his chin toward a nearby house, Julio's house. One of the thugs kicked the door open. The old man inside barely had time to react before they dragged him out, shoving him to his knees in the dirt. A knife glinted under the sun. The village gasped. Gabriel's pulse pounded in his ears. Ricardo watched him closely, gauging his reaction. "You leave," he said, "or I make sure that people you care about start suffering." Gabriel clenched his fists. His mind raced, assessing every possible outcome, every move he could make. But there was only one choice. He wasn't going to let Julio die. His teeth ground together as he forced the words out. "Let him go." Ricardo smiled. "Good." He gestured lazily, and his men released Julio. The old man gasped, stumbling forward. Gabriel caught him, steadying him. "See?" Ricardo said, stepping back. "You're smart, smarter than I thought." He turned, walking away, his men following. But before leaving, he stopped and looked at Gabriel over his shoulder. "You have one day," he said. "Then I don't care who gets in my way." And just like that, they were gone. But Gabriel knew the truth. They weren't done. Not even close. The wind carried the scent of the ocean through the village, but the air was heavy with something else. Fear. The people had seen the threat with their own eyes. They knew Ricardo meant every word he had said. Gabriel sat on the steps of his cabin, sharpening a fishing knife, though his mind was elsewhere. He had spent the last few years convincing himself that he had left his old life behind, that he was just another man trying to live in peace. But peace was no longer an option. A shadow moved near the edge of his vision. He tightened his grip on the knife, ready, until the figure stepped into the light. Gabriel froze. It was a face he hadn't seen in years. The man standing before him had the same sharp features, the same steel in his gaze that Gabriel remembered. His once black hair was now streaked with silver, but his presence was unchanged. Javier Morales. Gabriel slowly exhaled. "Didn't expect to see you here." Javier smirked. "Didn't expect to be here." He stepped forward, his boots kicking up dust. "But then I heard a rumor about a certain ex-soldier playing Fisherman." Gabriel remained silent. He didn't need to ask how Javier had found him. Some men were impossible to hide from. Javier crossed his arms. "I also heard about your little problem." Gabriel let out a humorless chuckle. "Didn't know you cared." Javier shrugged. "I don't." His expression turned serious. "But I do care about who Ricardo is working with." Gabriel's eyes narrowed. "You know him." Javier sighed, running a hand over his face. "I know who he answers to." Something cold settled in Gabriel's stomach. He had assumed Ricardo was just another local thug trying to control a fishing village. But this was something else. Javier sat on the railing of the porch. Ricardo isn't just some petty criminal shaking down villagers. He's got connections, real ones. The kind that move drugs, weapons, people. Gabriel's fingers tightened around the handle of the knife. "Who?" Javier met his gaze. "The Vega cartel." Gabriel's breath stilled. The name alone carried weight. The Vega cartel wasn't just some gang. They were an empire, spreading their influence across borders like a disease, ruthless, efficient. And now, they were here. Javier leaned forward. I don't know how deep Ricardo is with them, but if he's here, it means they see this place as valuable. Gabriel's mind raced. He had faced the cartel before, years ago in a mission that had gone terribly wrong. A mission that had cost lives. His men had been outnumbered, outgunned. The cartel had left no survivors, except him. He had buried that past, walked away from it. But it seemed the past wasn't done with him. Javier watched him closely. You have two choices, he said. You disappear or you fight. Gabriel didn't respond immediately. He had thought about running, leaving this place behind, starting over somewhere new, but he knew himself. He wouldn't run. Not this time. Gabriel stood, sliding the knife back into its sheath. I stay. Javier grinned. Thought so. He stood as well. Then you're going to need more than just a fishing knife. Gabriel exhaled. How much time do we have? Javier's expression turned grim. Not enough. They both knew what was coming. Ricardo wasn't just a threat to Gabriel anymore. He was a threat to everyone in the village. And Gabriel Costa had made his decision. He wasn't just going to fight, he was going to win. The village was silent under the weight of the coming storm. The people had seen enough to know what was coming, but they didn't know how to stop it. Gabriel Costa did. He stood at the edge of the shore, watching the waves roll in. Beside him, Javier Morales lit a cigarette, exhaling slowly. So, what's the plan, Comandante? Javier asked, a smirk tugging at his lips. Gabriel remained quiet for a moment before turning toward the village. We turn this place into something Ricardo won't expect. Javier raised an eyebrow. A battlefield? Gabriel nodded. He had spent his life in war zones, navigating ambushes, outnumbered but never outmatched. Ricardo had men, weapons, resources, but Gabriel had something better: strategy. He and Javier moved through the village, gathering the few men who were willing to fight. Some were older, others were young, but none were soldiers. Not yet. Ricardo won't attack in broad daylight, Gabriel said, addressing the small group. He wants fear. He wants to make an example out of us. He let his words settle. That's why we make this place a nightmare for him before he gets the chance. They started with the terrain. Gabriel mapped out the village as if it were an enemy compound. Every alley, every building, every escape route. The narrow streets could be used to funnel attackers. The rooftops provided elevation. The fishing nets, repurposed, became traps. Javier worked with the younger men, teaching them how to move, how to hold a knife, how to strike when it mattered. You don't need to be a soldier, he told them, just a survivor. Julio and some of the older fishermen rigged tripwires, turning everyday items into makeshift defenses. Glass bottles filled with gasoline, sharpened poles hidden in the sand, ropes tied between alleyways to trip attackers. By nightfall, the village was no longer just a village. It was a trap. Gabriel stood in the center of it all, his mind calculating every possible move Ricardo could make. He wasn't waiting for the enemy. He was welcoming them. Javier approached, tossing him a small, wrapped bundle. Gabriel unwrapped it to find a worn but reliable handgun. Thought you might need something more than a fishing knife, Javier said. Gabriel turned the weapon in his hands. He hadn't held one in years, but the weight was familiar. Too familiar. Javier watched him. You sure about this? Gabriel slid the gun into the waistband of his pants. I never was, he admitted. But that didn't matter anymore, because war was coming, and Gabriel Costa was ready. The night was thick with tension, the kind that settled deep in the bones. Gabriel Costa stood near the center of the village, his breath slow, steady. The ocean waves crashed in the distance, a deceptive contrast to the storm about to descend upon them. Javier Morales crouched beside him, scanning the darkened streets. They're coming. Gabriel had known this moment would arrive. Ricardo was too proud to let the defiance go unanswered. He would return, but this time not with warnings. This time he would come to destroy. The first sign of the attack was the flicker of movement at the edge of the village, shadows slipping between buildings, then a single gunshot, a warning, and then all hell broke loose. The first wave of attackers rushed in, expecting to find terrified villagers. Instead, they found a maze of traps. A fishing net snapped upward, ensnaring two men in the air. A tripwire sent another tumbling face first into the dirt. Gunfire erupted as Ricardo's men fired blindly, trying to take control. They didn't realize they were already losing. Gabriel moved with precision, using the shadows as his ally. A thug turned a corner, rifle raised. Too slow. Gabriel struck. A quick blow to the throat followed by a hard kick to the knee. The man collapsed. Javier fired from a rooftop, his shots precise. One by one, Ricardo's men dropped, confusion spreading among them. They had come expecting a slaughter. Instead, they had walked into a war. But the battle was far from over. A loud explosion shattered the night, one of the makeshift gasoline traps detonating near the docks. Flames erupted, casting the village in an eerie glow. The scent of burning wood filled the air. Gabriel cursed under his breath. Ricardo was escalating. Through the smoke he saw them, a second wave. More men, more weapons, more destruction. Gabriel turned to the villagers, still holding their ground. "Fall back to the central square, use the rooftops." They moved fast, disappearing into the village's tight alleys. Gabriel stayed behind. He had unfinished business. Through the chaos, he finally spotted him. Ricardo. The crime lord stood near the docks, watching the battle unfold with a cold smile. He wasn't leading the fight. He was enjoying it. Gabriel clenched his fists. This wasn't just about the village anymore. This was personal, and it wasn't over. Not yet. The flames cast long, flickering shadows across the village as the battle raged on. Gabriel Costa moved through the smoke, his body tense, his mind calculating. Ricardo was still out there. Gunfire echoed in the night, mixed with shouts of pain and panic. The traps had worked. Ricardo's men were losing ground, but Gabriel knew better than to believe this was the end. Ricardo wasn't a man who accepted failure. He was a man who took revenge. And then Gabriel heard the scream. His chest tightened as he turned toward the sound. The village square. He ran. His boots pounded against the dirt as he moved, weaving through the alleys. When he reached the clearing, his breath caught in his throat. Ricardo stood in the center of the square, a wicked grin on his face, and beside him, on his knees, was Julio. The old fisherman's face was bruised, blood trickling from his temple. Two of Ricardo's men held him in place, their grips tight on his shoulders. Gabriel's pulse thundered. Ricardo's cold eyes met his. "So you've been busy, fisherman." He gestured around at the burning village. "Impressive, but I told you before, you don't get to win." Gabriel took a slow step forward, his hands at his sides, controlled, calculated. "Let him go," Gabriel said, his voice even. Ricardo chuckled. "And why would I do that?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a pistol, pressing the barrel against Julio's temple. "You think this is a fight, Gabriel? It's not, it's a lesson." Gabriel's fists clenched. His mind raced through possible moves, ways to stop this before it was too late, but Ricardo wasn't giving him time. "You made a choice," Ricardo continued. "You decided to fight. And now," he pressed the gun harder against Julio's skull. "People pay the price." Gabriel took another step forward. "I don't have to do this." Ricardo smirked. "Oh, but I do." And then, a gunshot. Julio collapsed. Gabriel's world went still. The sound of the battle faded into nothingness. Only the sight of Julio's body remained. For a moment, nobody moved. Ricardo let out a satisfied breath, spinning the gun in his hand. His men stood at his sides, smirking, confident. They thought this was over. Gabriel's heart pounded. His breath was slow, measured, and then something inside him snapped. No more warnings, no more mercy. His body moved before his mind had finished forming the thought. He lunged, his hands striking fast and hard. The nearest thug barely had time to react before Gabriel's fist crashed into his jaw, sending him sprawling. The second thug raised his gun, too slow. Gabriel twisted his wrist, yanking the weapon from his grasp before slamming an elbow into his throat. One down. Ricardo took a step back, startled by the sudden explosion of violence. "You shouldn't have done that," Gabriel growled. For the first time, Ricardo looked uncertain. Good, but this wasn't over. Ricardo recovered quickly, his smirk returning. He gestured to the remaining men. "Kill him." They rushed forward, but Gabriel was already moving. He wasn't fighting as a fisherman now. He was fighting as the soldier he had tried to bury. The first attacker swung wildly. A mistake. Gabriel ducked, grabbed his arm, and twisted. A sickening crack followed. The man screamed, falling to the ground. The second came at him with a knife. Gabriel sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and slammed his knee into the man's gut. Another one down. Ricardo had seen enough. His smirk disappeared as he raised his gun. Gabriel turned just in time to see the muzzle flash. Pain tore through his side. He staggered, his vision blurring for a second. Blood seeped through his shirt, hot and sticky. But he didn't fall. Not yet. Ricardo took a step closer, gun still aimed. "You should have walked away." Gabriel gritted his teeth. "So should you." With the last of his strength, he lunged. His shoulder slammed into Ricardo's chest, knocking the gun away. They crashed to the ground, rolling in the dirt. Gabriel ignored the pain, focusing on one thing: ending this. Ricardo threw a punch, but Gabriel caught his wrist, twisting it sharply. Ricardo cried out, his confidence finally cracking. Gabriel pressed his knee into Ricardo's chest, pinning him. His breath was ragged, his body screaming in pain, but his hands were steady as he grabbed Ricardo's own gun and aimed it at his head. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Gabriel's finger hovered over the trigger. This was it, the moment to end it. Ricardo glared up at him, chest heaving. "Go on, do it." Gabriel exhaled slowly. His hand trembled, and then he lowered the gun. "You're not worth the bullet," he said. Before Ricardo could respond, Gabriel struck him hard across the face. The crime lord's body went limp, unconscious. The village was silent now. The battle was over. But at what cost? Gabriel turned his gaze to Julio's lifeless body. The price had already been paid, and Gabriel Costa was done running. The village was eerily quiet in the aftermath of the battle. Smoke still lingered in the air, the distant crackling of dying flames the only sound that remained. Gabriel Costa stood in the village square, his shirt stained with blood, his own and others. His ribs ached with every breath, but he barely noticed. His gaze was locked on Ricardo's unconscious body, lying in the dirt where Gabriel had left him. Javier Morales approached from the shadows, a rifle slung over his shoulder. "He's still breathing?" Gabriel nodded. "For now," Javier scoffed. "You should have finished him." Gabriel exhaled. He had wanted to. God, he had wanted to. But killing Ricardo in anger wouldn't have undone what had been lost. And this wasn't over. Not yet. Javier knelt beside Ricardo, nudging him roughly with his boot. "We should at least tie him up before he wakes up." Gabriel wasn't listening. His mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. He turned to the few villagers who had gathered around the square, their faces weary but determined. They had fought. They had survived. But the war wasn't finished. Ricardo wasn't working alone, Gabriel said, his voice low but firm. "He has connections, bigger ones." Javier sighed. "The Vega cartel." A ripple of fear passed through the crowd. Everyone knew the name. They weren't just criminals. They were an empire. Gabriel's jaw tightened. "If we don't act now, they'll come. They'll see what happened here, and they won't stop until they burn this place to the ground." Silence. The weight of his words settled over the group. Julio had already paid the price. Gabriel wouldn't let anyone else suffer the same fate. Javier crossed his arms. "So what's the move?" Gabriel turned back to Ricardo's body. The answer was right in front of them. "We use him." Javier raised an eyebrow. "Use him? How?" Gabriel crouched beside Ricardo, gripping the man's collar and shaking him roughly. "Time to wake up." Ricardo groaned, his eyes fluttering open. The moment he realized where he was, he tensed. Fear flickered behind his gaze, but only for a second. Then he smirked. Gabriel didn't react. He simply tightened his grip on Ricardo's shirt. "You have 2 choices," he said, voice like steel. "You make a call to your bosses. You tell them this village isn't worth the trouble. You tell them to forget this place exists." Ricardo let out a weak chuckle. "And if I don't?" Gabriel leaned closer. "Then I make sure you disappear before they ever find you." Ricardo's smirk faltered. Javier grinned. "I like this plan." Gabriel didn't smile. He had no illusions that Ricardo would simply give in. Men like him thrived on power, on fear. But Gabriel knew something Ricardo didn't. He wasn't afraid anymore. He had already lost too much. Gabriel pulled Ricardo to his feet. "Make the call." Ricardo hesitated, but when he saw the cold certainty in Gabriel's eyes, he exhaled sharply. "Fine." Javier handed him a phone, keeping his rifle trained on him. Ricardo dialed, the line ringing twice before someone answered. A voice Gabriel didn't recognize. Cold. Professional. High up. Ricardo swallowed. "Yeah, it's me," the voice on the other end spoke. Gabriel couldn't hear the words, but he could see the tension in Ricardo's face. Then Ricardo glanced at Gabriel. "No," he said into the phone. It's taken care of. The village, there's nothing left worth fighting for. It's done. A pause. Gabriel watched every micro-expression, every shift in Ricardo's tone. He wasn't lying, because he knew what would happen if he did. The voice spoke again. Ricardo's jaw clenched. Then finally, understood. The call ended. Gabriel exhaled. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was a start. Ricardo looked at him, eyes burning with hatred. "You think this is over?" he spat. Gabriel's expression remained unreadable. "I think you should leave." Javier nudged him forward with the barrel of his rifle. "And don't come back." Ricardo hesitated. For the first time in his life, he was powerless. Then, with a slow nod, he turned and walked away. Out of the village. Out of their lives. For now. Gabriel watched until he disappeared into the night. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. The village had survived. But the war wasn't over. The village was still standing, but Gabriel Costa knew the fight wasn't finished. Ricardo had walked away, but the look in his eyes had made something clear. He wasn't done. The call to the Vega cartel had bought them time, but it wouldn't erase what had happened. Men like Ricardo never accepted defeat. Gabriel stood at the edge of the docks, staring out at the dark ocean. The scent of salt filled the air, mixing with the lingering smoke from the battle. Javier Morales leaned against a wooden post beside him, arms crossed. "You don't believe it's over, do you?" Javier asked. Gabriel shook his head. "No," Javier sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that." The villagers had begun repairing what was left of their homes, trying to push forward as if life could go back to normal, but Gabriel knew better. Ricardo would return. And next time he wouldn't come alone. Gabriel turned to Javier. "We need to be ready." Javier smirked. "I thought you'd say that." They spent the next hours gathering weapons, old hunting rifles, knives, anything that could be useful. The village wasn't full of fighters, but it had survivors, and survivors could learn. Then just before dawn, it happened. A boat appeared on the horizon, cutting through the dark waters like a predator stalking its prey. It wasn't a fishing boat. It was something else. Gabriel's jaw tightened. "They're here." Javier lifted his rifle, peering through the scope. Damn, that's not just Ricardo. Gabriel already knew. The boat docked, and men spilled onto the shore. Not just thugs, but cartel enforcers. Their movements were sharp, disciplined, trained killers, and leading them was Ricardo. He stepped forward, his smirk sharper than before. "Did you really think a phone call would make me go away?" he called out. Gabriel didn't answer. He was already assessing 6 men armed. This wasn't a simple warning, this was an execution. Javier tensed beside him. This is bad. Gabriel's mind was already calculating. The village wasn't defenseless anymore, but this was different. These men knew how to kill. Ricardo gestured lazily. This time, no warnings. His men raised their weapons, and then, gunfire. Gabriel dove behind a stack of wooden crates as bullets splintered the air around him. Javier returned fire, his shots forcing Ricardo's men to take cover. The battle had begun. Gabriel moved fast, staying low, flanking around the side of the village. He couldn't win this fight with brute force. He needed strategy. He spotted one of Ricardo's enforcers near the fish market, reloading his rifle. A mistake. Gabriel struck fast. One sharp blow to the throat, then a knee to the ribs. The man collapsed before he could fire another shot. Javier took down another from the rooftops, but they were still outnumbered. Gabriel could feel the tide shifting. They needed something more. Then he saw it, the old fishing boat at the docks, still loaded with fuel. A plan formed. Gabriel turned to one of the villagers. "Get to the boat. Light it up." The man hesitated but nodded, disappearing into the shadows. Ricardo, still standing in the open, laughed. "You can't win this, Fisherman." Gabriel's eyes darkened. "We'll see." Then, fire. The fishing boat erupted in flames, the explosion sending a shockwave through the docks. Ricardo's men turned in panic, distracted, and Gabriel moved. He sprinted forward, grabbing one of the enforcers and using his own momentum to slam him into the ground. One by one they were falling, but then, pain. A sudden force knocked Gabriel to the ground. A bullet had grazed his side. He gritted his teeth, rolling away before Ricardo could fire again. Javier took the shot. Ricardo's gun was knocked from his hand, clattering to the ground. For the first time he looked afraid. Gabriel staggered to his feet, blood staining his side. The battle was nearly over. And now it was just him and Ricardo. One last fight, One last move. The battle was over. What remained was vengeance. Gabriel Costa stood in the village square, blood staining his side, muscles burning from the fight. Around him, Ricardo's men lay defeated. Some unconscious, others groaning in pain, their weapons scattered across the dirt. And then there was Ricardo. The crime lord was on his knees, his face twisted in rage and disbelief. His gun had been knocked away. His men had failed. For the first time, Ricardo Tubarão was powerless. Javier Morales stepped forward, rifle in hand. "Say the word," he muttered to Gabriel. Gabriel didn't move. He stared at Ricardo, his breathing heavy but controlled. This man had terrorized the village, killed Julio, burned homes, and now he was nothing more than a man facing the consequences of his own arrogance. Ricardo spat blood onto the dirt, then smirked. "You think this means anything?" His voice was hoarse, but his eyes still held defiance. "You think killing me stops the cartel?" Gabriel's fingers twitched at his side. The old him would have ended this right now. A quick pull of the trigger and it would be over, but he wasn't that man anymore. "No," Gabriel said, his voice calm. "Killing you won't stop them, but leaving you alive." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over Ricardo. "That sends a message." Ricardo's smirk faltered. "You're bluffing." Gabriel didn't blink. "Try me." He crouched beside Ricardo, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "I know how men like you think. You're a coward, Ricardo. You hide behind the cartel's power, behind threats and weak men who follow you out of fear." Gabriel's tone turned sharp. "But they failed. You failed." Ricardo swallowed. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. Gabriel stood. "Now you're going to do something for me." Ricardo let out a weak laugh. "And what's that?" "You're going to disappear." Gabriel's voice was final. "You're going to tell your bosses that this village isn't worth the trouble. You're going to tell them that coming back here is a mistake." He leaned in, his gaze cold. "And if I ever see you again, I won't hesitate next time." Silence. Ricardo clenched his jaw, his bravado cracking. "And if I refuse?" Gabriel didn't answer with words. Instead, he grabbed Ricardo's own gun from the ground and pressed it against the man's forehead. Click. No words, no threats, just the promise of certainty. Ricardo's breath hitched. Gabriel held the gun there for a long moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. Then finally he pulled back. "Go," he ordered. Ricardo hesitated. Then, slowly, he stood, his movements stiff and reluctant. Javier scoffed. "Can't believe you're letting him walk." Gabriel exhaled. "Men like him destroy themselves eventually." Ricardo took one last look at Gabriel before turning away, limping toward the docks. His men, those still able to stand, dragged themselves after him. Gabriel watched them disappear into the night. Only when they were gone did he allow himself to breathe. The village was safe. For now. Javier shook his head. "You really think that's the last we'll see of him?" Gabriel looked toward the horizon, where the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. He didn't answer. Some battles never truly ended. But for the first time in a long time, Gabriel Costa felt something close to peace, and that was enough. The sun rose slowly over the village, casting golden light over the ruins of the battle. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and salt, a lingering reminder of the fight that had nearly destroyed them. Gabriel Costa stood at the edge of the docks, watching the waves roll in. His body ached, his wounds still fresh, but the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. They had won. Javier Morales approached, hands in his pockets. "So, what now?" Gabriel exhaled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The village rebuilds." Javier smirked. "And you?" Gabriel didn't answer immediately. He had come here seeking peace, running from a past he thought he could leave behind. But the truth had become painfully clear. He could never truly escape who he was. "I don't know," he admitted. Javier studied him for a moment before nodding. "Well, if you ever need backup, you know where to find me." Gabriel offered a small, tired smile. Behind them, the villagers worked together, repairing what had been destroyed. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were fighters. As Gabriel turned away from the ocean, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. He had made enemies today, but he had also made a choice, and whatever came next, he would be ready.